Good afternoon. It is 1 o'clock Central Time. We're going to go ahead and get started with our presentation for the Airman Certification Standards Explained. We appreciate you guys chiming in today to learn about the ACS. This will take about an hour, and we'll try real hard to stay on schedule. I am Chris Morris. I work with AFS 630. I'm the presenter today, and we do have some other employees from AFS 630 on the call as well. We have Robert Terry, Jeff Spangler, and Matt McNaughton. Now, Robert and Jeff and Mac, their job is to watch for your questions. I'll tell you in just a moment how you actually submit questions to be answered during the webinar. We'll go over that so that you understand how that works. So we're happy to have those folks helping us out today. And I do want to give you a little bit of an overview before we jump into the content. This webinar is designed to supplement a course that we have developed that's available free of charge at FAASTeam.gov. If you haven't seen this course yet, I really recommend that you get in there sometime and go over this one. It's course ALC 449 is the course name. You could also just search ACS at FAASTeam.gov. And again, that's free of charge, and it does, I'm pretty sure it does provide some WINGS credit if you're participating in the WINGS program. So let's go over what we're going to discuss. I'm going to give you a little background on why we changed, why we are going with the Airman Certification Standards, and I want to touch briefly on who actually developed the Airman Certification Standards. I think you're going to find that really interesting. And then we'll get into some of the detail of how the document is actually used during a practical test. And then we'll finish up with what else is changing regarding the ACS. We'll go over the effective dates, and we have some tips for things that you can do to help prepare yourself to use the ACS. And this is a very popular slide, which is where can you get additional help. We have lots of references for you where you can look at our frequently asked questions, or you can email if you have a specific question. And at the very end, we will have a survey, and we'll talk more about that in just a bit, but that's at the very end. So the first thing to go over is why change? Well, surprisingly enough, this change is really based on the knowledge test questions. If you're like me, when you first started hearing about the Airman Certification Standards, the fact that it was replacing the practical test standards, you just make the automatic assumption, well, they're wanting to update the practical test. That's what this change is about. And actually, that's really not the truth. This change started off with deficiencies that we identified with our knowledge testing system, with what we call the written exams. So we realized that over the years, some of our questions had become outdated. Some of them were irrelevant. Some had errors in them. I imagine some of you are shaking your head going, yep, I've seen those questions, I've answered those questions. So the agency did recognize that we had some concerns with our knowledge test questions. And we knew that one of the problems is that our questions needed to have a standard on which they were based. The practical test standards have always guided the practical test. In other words, that's the standards document for the practical test. Tells you what has to be part of the practical test. But we didn't have anything like that for the knowledge test. So the knowledge test questions were just sort of, born over the years of various people sitting down with the references, for example, the Pilot's Handbook of Bare Knuckle Knowledge, and coming up with questions in particular subjects that maybe they thought were interesting. Where at the end of the day, the questions that they provided may have been, questions that were actually in the reference material, but maybe not horribly relevant for actual operation's sake. So we recognized that we had this concern. Back in 2011, an Airman Testing Standards and Training Aviation Rulemaking Committee was created. I know that's a mouthful, you don't have to remember that, but just the point is that back in 2011, the FAA put together a work group and said, we know we have some issues with our knowledge test, and we need you folks to give us some suggestions on how to fix the knowledge test. So back in 2012, the work group recommended that we create the Airman Certification Standards. And the Airman Certification Standards would become a document that would behave as not only the standards for the practical test, just like the PTS does, but would also provide standards information about the knowledge test. So would give us guidance as to what types of questions should be included on the knowledge test. So that's kind of how it all came to be. I also want to take a minute and explain to you who actually developed the Airman certification standards. Historically, the agency would develop their own policies and that sort of thing, and it would happen all internally, and then those things would get released to the public, and then they'd go into effect. And frequently, there was not any public input. Okay, and that's kind of just been the way it's gone for a long time, you know, generally speaking. Well, part of this working group that developed the Airman certification standards was actually comprised of both FAA and industry leaders. I'm going to show you a slide here that has the majority of the industry participants listed. I'm not going to read through this list, but it certainly gives you an idea of all of the industry folks that played a very important role in developing the Airman certification standards. And I want to make it clear that this isn't a case where the agency wrote the ACS and then provided it to these folks maybe for comment, but these folks actually wrote the document. They put pen to paper and wrote the document, and then working with the FAA, we would go through and vet the document and make sure that it was going to function well and serve everyone's needs. So, of course, there's the FAA side. We've got one entry there, but we have lots of different divisions involved in the development as well. So, hopefully that gives you an idea of all the folks involved. So now we're going to dig into some of the meat of it, and that is, you know, how does the ACS actually work? We do have some usage tips, particularly useful if this is your first time to ever see the ACS and you're first looking at it. My suggestion is carefully read through the introduction first. Some of the content has changed from the practical test standard. Things have been rearranged and such, so don't skip the introduction thinking, oh, what's the same as the PTS, because it's not. It's somewhat different. So start with that, and then I would skip to the back and carefully review the appendices. There's a handful of them back there, and again, the information is different from how it was arranged in the PTS. Remember that this document, the ACS, not only is a standards document for the practical test, but it's also a standards document for the knowledge test. So you're going to see both of those things referenced in the appendices. So, for example, Appendix 1 is knowledge test eligibility, prerequisites, and testing centers. So that one just kind of gives you a general idea of, you know, what you have to have in place to be able to take a knowledge test. Appendix 2 is knowledge test procedures and tips. There's a lot of good information in there, particularly if you'll be taking the knowledge test soon. I do want to mention a lot of this stuff isn't new. This stuff was available in various other FAA publications, but now we've pulled them all together so you have one place to find all these. Knowledge test 3, Appendix 3 is the knowledge test report. It tells you how to decode your knowledge test report, PLT codes, that sort of thing is in there. And then Appendix 4 is practical test eligibility and prerequisites. Again, same sort of thing as what was in the PTS, just been rearranged a bit, so I would certainly go over that one with your highlighter and look for anything that gets your interest. Appendix 5 is practical test roles, responsibilities, and outcomes. Again, this one hasn't changed other than being rearranged and reworded. The content is the same, but this is a really important appendix to understand if you have a practical test coming up. It explains to you what constitutes satisfactory performance or what would be unsatisfactory performance. Anyway, so a really important section to look at there. And then 6 is safety of flight. A lot of good info there. It's things such as minimum altitude during maneuvers and that sort of thing. 7 explains what aircraft and equipment you have to provide during the practical test. And then 8 is use of flight simulation training devices. And then wrapping up 9 and 10, those are various references that are used during the development, and then abbreviations and acronyms. So that's a real quick look at the appendices, and there are definitely some of those that you might want to go a little bit slower on and make sure that you digest that. So after you have looked at those, then I would start looking at the body of the ACS, and that's what we're going to talk about now, is how the ACS is arranged and how it's actually used during a practical test. So the good news is it's the same basic organization as the practical test standards. You have areas of operations, tasks, and elements, just like you did in the PTS. So if you're familiar with those things under the PTS, those same concepts apply here as well. So that's kind of helpful. Here's an example. This is part of an ACS excerpt. So your area of operation in this example, this is area of operation 1, which is pre-flight preparation. And then your task would be task delta, which is called cross-country flight planning. And then you have all these elements then listed down off the side. Okay, so it looks a little bit different than the PTS, but the general structure is the same. Now we have added something new called ACS Codes, and I want to explain that to you. You see it's really pretty straightforward, and we use ACS Codes quite frequently to pinpoint an exact element that we want to talk about or review. So I'm pointing here with my green arrow to an ACS code, and I just want to kind of tell you how that's read. The PA is the certification practical, it's the ACS document essentially that we're talking about. So this is private pilot airplane is abbreviated PA. And then we have the 1, which tells you your area of operation, and then the D is your task, which is cross-country flight planning in this example. And then the last one, the K2, tells you what element. So you can see that if I were to give you an ACS code, you can very quickly tell me what document you would need to look at, PA being private pilot, for example, and then you can see what area of operation, what task, and what element. So you can drill really quickly down to particular elements. And we didn't have that kind of clarity when we were in the PTS. There wasn't a way to really easily reference like that in a single code. So you'll see in a minute how we'll be using that code in the future, and I think it'll help us out. So I want to talk about now a little bit how the Airman Certification Standards is used when someone is developing a plan of action. So, for example, if you're a designee, if you're someone that conducts check rides, we're going to talk about the rules that that person uses when they're developing your plan of action. And a plan of action, if you haven't heard that term before, is basically a written guide that is created for every person's check ride. Okay, so as someone, if you are going to take a check ride, you can be sure that the designee conducting your check, they have a written plan of action in front of them. It's not something they might normally share with you. They might not say, hey, look at my plan of action, because it's a document for their use. But they develop that plan of action using the Airman Certification Standards, or historically using the practical test standards. So we're going to go over the rules that that person uses when preparing for your practical test. And this will help you as an applicant and as an instructor understand what you can expect on that practical test, whether you're the one taking it or you're signing someone off to go take a check ride. So we'll start with the first item, which is the areas of operations. So the question is, what areas of operations will be included on the practical test? Well, this is a pretty easy one. It's all of them, okay? All areas of operation will be included on the practical test unless they specifically don't apply to your check ride. And I'm going to give you an example because it's pretty clear to tell when they wouldn't apply. This is from the private pilot ACS. Area of operation 10 is multi-engine operations. And all of the tasks in this area of operation apply only to multi-engine airplanes. So if you're taking a check ride in a Cessna 172, you can be confident that you will not be required to demonstrate anything from Area of Operation 10. That's about the only exception, by the way, that I can think of. All of the other areas of operations will always be included in the private airplane plans of actions. So easy rule of thumb, just say all areas have to be prepared for by the applicant unless it doesn't apply to your aircraft. So now we'll go to the next level. The next thing under areas of operations are tasks. So again, the rule is pretty easy here. All tasks are required from each applicable area of operation unless it doesn't specifically apply to your aircraft, and I'm going to give you an example of that. So this is task delta, which is taxiing, and you'll notice that it says ASEL, AMEL. So this task would be performed by applicants taking a check ride for airplane single-engine land or airplane multi-engine land. By contrast, look at task ECHO, which is titled Taxiing and Sailing. This one is for applicants taking check rides in airplane single-engine C or airplane multi-engine C. So you can see how those two you would pick whichever one of those two applies for your aircraft or your check ride. So if they're labeled like this, ASEL or AMEL, then that means it might vary by your aircraft. If there's no label on the task at all, it applies to everyone and it's always required. So hopefully that kind of narrows down the task side of it as to what you can expect for the check ride. Then the last one, the most detailed area, is the elements. So there have been some changes at this level of the ACS when comparing it with the PTS. So I kind of like to start this talk by comparing it with the PTS. So you're looking on screen at an excerpt from the Private Pilot Airplane Practical Test Standards. This particular task is the pre-flight inspection. This is the entire task. This is all that is included in the PTS. And it only had 3 elements, which I'm pointing to there. And you can see generally those elements are talking about inspecting the aircraft, knowing why you should look for certain items, how can you tell if something is defective. Talks about using a checklist, and then number 3 says verifies the airplane's in safe condition for flight. That was the extent of the guidance provided by the PTS. So when they developed the Airman certification standards, the work group was assigned to take the existing elements and existing standards and start working those into this new document, the Airman certification standards. So those elements I just showed you were moved from the PTS into the ACS. An important point I need to make, though, is that they were not necessarily moved verbatim. They were allowed to rephrase them and rearrange them a bit. Okay, so you will notice that things have been rephrased and rearranged a little bit, but conceptually, the ideas will still be there. It'll be the same concepts. Okay, so after they included the already existing elements from the PTS, we then began to add some additional elements. Those of you that have seen the ACS and have flipped through some of the pages and seen there's quite a few elements listed for various tasks. I want to explain to you where those elements came from, and then we'll also talk about how they're arranged. So some of the reasons that we had to add additional elements, well, number one, sometimes the PTS concepts were divided into individual elements. For example, the PTS would often have a single element, but it might have 3 or 4 concepts included within it. When we came to the ACS, sometimes we would divide that up into individual elements. Okay, so you wouldn't have 4 elements in a single, let me rephrase, you wouldn't have 4 concepts in a single paragraph. We'd split them up into individual sentences, for example, and each sentence would be an element. So that was one reason that the element count grew. Now the second reason is, remember, this document not only accounts for the practical test, but it also acts as a standards document for the knowledge test. So there are a lot of new elements, particularly in the knowledge section, which we'll talk about, that guide the test creators into what material is acceptable for a knowledge test, and what type of materials can be included for testing. So that added a lot of additional elements to our list. Then we also added risk management elements. Risk management has been an important part of the practical test standards, but it generally lived up in the introduction section and wasn't really distributed very well or itemized out with individual tasks. So now we have risk management elements that are built into each task, and this helps highlight those risk concepts and makes it easier to see which ones can be addressed there. And then finally, our special emphasis items. Again, these lived up in the introduction of the PTS, and now they've been moved out individually into the ACS. So that explains why we had such a growth in the element count. And now I'm going to explain to you how we arrange those elements so that they are useful during a check ride. So we arranged them into 3 groups. The first group is called knowledge elements. We also call those K elements, K for knowledge. And those are things that the applicant should be able to know, sort of, book learning sort of things, okay? So things you should know. And then we have a risk management element group. Those are things that the applicant should be able to consider, risks involved in a particular task or operation and ways to mitigate that risk. And then finally, we have our skill elements, which are things that the applicant should be able to do, like performing certain tasks and things. We also call those S elements, just for short. So I want to give you an example, again, of how this translated from the PTS to the ACS. So I kind of do this for effect because it's kind of fun. So here's the PTS showing you how this task was designed in the PTS world, and now I'm going to show you the same task under the ACS. So yes, it grew quite a bit. Okay, I've spent some time explaining to you why we had such an increase in count. I want to point first to the green arrows. Those green arrows on this page represent the original elements. Okay, so these are the things that were carried in from the PTS. And then I want to point out to you the upper section there, the knowledge elements. It has the word knowledge, and you have, if you look at the ACS code, you have K1 through K6 along the left-hand side of the document. Those are knowledge elements, and then you have your risk management elements as well, about the middle of the screen. And then the bottom of the screen, you have your skill elements, which are like S1 through S6. So the next question that we frequently get is, oh my gosh, this is going to be a 12-hour check ride because now we have to cover all of these elements and it's going to take forever. Well, a couple things I want to say about that is, first off, the actual core material hasn't changed any. For example, in the PTS, you're studying airspace. You would study all the various classes of airspace. And in the ACS, that's the same classes of airspace, same entry requirements. Those things haven't changed any. So the core background knowledge that you have to have, that you would study, hasn't changed. What has changed is to what level we're able to detail down those particular items. Okay, so so hopefully that helps a little bit. When you look at that huge list, you know that it isn't more material necessarily. It's just been broken down to a much more fine level. Okay, and there's a reason for that. We'll look at that in just a minute. So the next thing I want to say to you is we're going to talk about which of those elements actually must be tested on the practical test. Okay, so that's what we're going to start. Is when the examiner is making your plan of action, I want to explain to you which elements will be included on the knowledge test. So the first rule of thumb that the examiner has to satisfy is anything that you miss on the written exam, on your knowledge test, they have to address those things during the practical test. I'm going to give you an example kind of how that works. Let's say, for example, on your knowledge test report, you get a PLT code 064. And you have to look at the learning statement guide to tell you what does that stand for, what type of material did you miss. So PLT 064 stands for Interpret Information on a Sectional Chart. So that means the examiner has to ask you questions about interpreting information on a sectional chart. Now, we have asked examiners to be able to actually identify a particular element to the best of their ability. So what they would then do is they look at the ACS. Here's an excerpt I have for you here. They look at the ACS and they find a reasonable match to that material. So, interpret information on a sectional chart. I spent a few minutes looking at the ACS, and I found that there is a knowledge element, K8, symbology found on VFR charts, including airspace, obstructions, and terrain features. That is a really good match to your PLT code. It's not verbatim, it's not word for word, but we're looking for conceptual matches. Okay, and we do recognize that one examiner may pick a slightly different ACS code than a different one, but as long as the same concept is being evaluated, then that's going to satisfy our requirements. So in this case, the examiner would include Kilo 8 on your practical test because you missed that on your knowledge test. So so now we're continuing on with the other elements that must be in the plan of action. So we've already said this one, any subject missed on the knowledge test must be included. We've got that one. So the next rule says, at a minimum, the plan of action must include at least one knowledge element. So I want you to think about that just for a moment. I showed you a task a few minutes ago, and it had a handful of knowledge elements, quite a few. The minimum requirement is only one, has to be evaluated during the practical test. So hopefully now you go, oh, I see, they're not going to ask me necessarily about every single one of these. They only have to ask me one at a minimum. So that will help keep things in scope. Now, it's one at a minimum, so the examiner could decide to ask you one or two or three. And in theory, the examiner could decide to ask you all of them. But we're not seeing that as a general course of business. That's just not generally how examiners behave out in the field. Feedback that we're receiving is most folks are hitting one, two, maybe three elements and moving on. Okay. So the next rule is they have to address at least one risk management element. Okay, so again, this is the second type of element, and they have to ask just one of those. And again, that's a minimum. They could do more, but one at a minimum. And then the last type of element is the skill element. And the examiner is required to evaluate all of the skill elements. So that one's a little bit different than the first two. The first two was one each. And then the last one is all skill elements must be evaluated during the check ride. Okay, so in just a second, we're going to work through a little scenario. So I think that you'll see kind of how this works together and make a little more sense to you. Just kind of bring it home. I do first have to mention something called sub-elements because I don't want it to throw you and give you any trouble. So on screen, you can see an example of sub-elements. And sub-elements are those that end in letters. Like we have Kilo 4, which is meteorology, and then Kilo 4A, and then B and C, which are just, much more clearly refined sections or topics under meteorology. based on those rules I told you where your examiner has to select at least one knowledge element at a minimum, sub-elements behave exactly the same as any other element for that rule of thumb. They can be treated exactly the same as any other knowledge element. What I mean by that is your examiner could elect to evaluate you on 4 kilo hotel thunderstorms. They could pick just that one element and decide to test you on that topic, and that could satisfy the minimum for the Airman certification standards. So they don't have to pick A through J, for example. Okay, so don't let sub-elements throw you off. Just because it's got an A or a B in the back, it's treated like any other knowledge element and behaves the same. Okay. Just like with the PTS, examiners are allowed to combine tasks and elements where it's appropriate to make an efficient check ride. So if multiple elements are asking questions about, let's say, Class A airspace, if they've already talked to you about airspace, they don't have to ask the questions again 5 minutes later. They've already asked you. So they can combine those. And that's the same thing with the PTS. And so because of those things, we have not seen that the ACS is actually increasing the length of the check rides. I know that was a common concern by folks when the ACS first came out because they saw all those elements. And we're happy to say that our prototyping before we released the ACS did not indicate there'd be any significant increase in check ride length, and we're actually seeing that to be true now that we've had a few months to have it out in the field, that it's staying about the same. So that's good news. Okay, so let's look at a scenario. We're kind of wrapping up this real technical bit of it, so I appreciate you hanging in there with me. So on the left-hand side, I have your rules. We've already talked about these. This is the list of things that your examiner must include in the plan of action for your practical test. Number one, they have to include any items from the knowledge test report, at least one K element, at least one R, and then all S's. So here is a ACS element. I mean, this is a task, pre-flight assessment. This is the complete task. So let's put our examiner hats on and get our highlighter out, and we're going to go through this process just like your examiner is going to do. This is the same general process that they'll follow when they're preparing your plan of action for your check ride. So rule number one says anything that was missed on your knowledge test report must be included. So just for argument's sake, let's say that you missed PLT 445. Okay, so you missed a question related to that on your knowledge test. So you look that one up and it says regulations regarding pre-flight requirements. So what the examiner has to do is they have to look through and find a reasonable match to that concept, the concept being pre-flight regulations. So there is an element, Kilo 3 Delta. It says the associated regulations. This will make more sense to you if you read it from Kilo 3. Go up just a few lines, and it says aircraft pre-flight inspection, including the associated regulations. So that's actually a pretty good match for what you missed on the knowledge test report. So as an examiner, I'm going to highlight that activity because I'm going to make sure to include that on my plan of action. So you see now we've satisfied the first requirement. The next requirement is we have to have at least one K element. So looking at those list of elements, I do already have a K element. I already selected Kilo 3 Delta because it was missed on the knowledge test report. So the good news is here, that already satisfies my 1 K element requirement because I already picked one out. So that's kind of nice. And of course, the examiner could select additional K elements if they wish to. The next rule says I have at least one risk management element. So I didn't select anything based on the knowledge test report. So honestly, it becomes examiner's selection here. Just whatever the examiner thinks is going to work well with their scenario-based check ride. And in this case, I kind of like the external pressures. I'm going to highlight that one because I have a scenario where you're flying to a football game in another city, but the weather's kind of marginal. So we're going to kind of work on that scenario during our check ride. So it'd be really easy for me as an examiner to work in external pressures into the check ride. And so we've got that one satisfied. And then the last requirement is all skill elements must be included. So this one really pretty straightforward. I have to select all of these elements to be used in my plan of action. I don't get to pick any of those. They're all going to be included. So if you look at just the highlighted things from this particular task, it's really not the bulk of the page. It's just a few things from the page. So that helps us contain the length of the check ride. So hopefully that kind of helps you see. And of course the examiner will continue and do this for all the remaining tasks until they've got your plan of action. So a couple of little things I want to kind of wrap up with. We've had a lot of questions about timing of knowledge and risk management elements. And let me explain what that means. If you look at this task, this is maneuvering during slow flight. And it has about 6 knowledge elements, and it has about 7 risk management elements, and it has several skills. I didn't include all of them here in the screenshot. And of course, the examiner has to pick at least 1 knowledge and at least 1 risk. So the question that we have a lot from folks is, do they have to save these questions? Do they have to assess this knowledge element and this risk management element once they're in the airplane performing slow flight? Because these questions come up kind of in the flight portion of the ACS check ride. And the answer is no. Okay, just because there are knowledge and risk management elements in what is traditionally thought of as a flight maneuver, during slow flight, that's something you can go do out in the airplane, does not mean that you have to wait until you're in the airplane to assess these things. Let me give you a little example. Look at Kilo 5 for me. Kilo 5 is environmental elements that affect aircraft performance. So your examiner may select that one, and they may want to talk to you about how density altitude might affect slow flight. Okay, that's a it's a good question to ask. There was absolutely no reason that your examiner couldn't do that during the ground portion, right? When you're sitting in a comfortable space and you can spend some time talking about density altitude and how it may impact slow flight, that's the time to do that. However, the examiner could certainly ask questions during the flight. You know that that's allowed. It's always been allowed. So we're not telling folks that they can't ask these questions during the flight portion, but we are encouraging the examiners to ask these sorts of questions when you're on the ground and you're able to have a nice conversation about these things and not so distracted looking for traffic and performing the maneuver. So I hope that kind of helps you with the timing of Ks and Rs. They can be done at any time during the check ride, but we prefer that they get moved up front to the oral bit just because it makes more sense from a safety perspective to do it then. So that's kind of what I just said on screen, so I'm not going to go back through those slides again, but you'll have those. All right, so now it's time for a little bit of a knowledge check. I want to see if you were paying attention. I'm going to ask you about 3 questions. We'll see how you do. So here comes the first question, and we'll give you about 30 seconds to answer this one. There's 30 seconds, and we have almost 75% have participated. Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and close that poll. I'm going to share the results with all of you, and we'll talk about them just real briefly. So I think it's coming up on screen. So the question in general is, of the 3 types of elements, which is something that the applicant should be able to consider? And that is a risk management element. So great job. The K elements are something that the applicant should know. And then the S elements or skill elements are things that the applicant should be able to do. Just kind of an easy way to remember how those different elements behave. So I have a another one for you. So I'll give you a few seconds to try this one out for me. Okay, we're coming up on 30 seconds. About 80% of you voted. Thank you very much. I'm going to close that poll and share the results for you. The question was, what is the minimum number of skill elements the evaluator must assess? Well, the skill elements, it's all. Okay, the evaluator has to assess all skill elements, so you guys did really good on that one. Regarding the knowledge element, it's 1 at a minimum, and then the risk management element is 1 at a minimum. So I have one more question for you, and then we can wrap up these questions. So I'll give you 30 seconds to answer this one. We're coming up on 30 seconds. About 80% of you have voted, so that's great. I'm going to go ahead and close that poll, and I'll let you guys all see the results. So the question was, can the evaluator assess more than 1 knowledge element during the practical test? And you guys certainly see this. The answer is yes, right? 1 is the minimum, but the evaluator can certainly evaluate more than just the minimum. And so good job on that one. So I'm going to go ahead and take that one away. So thank you very much for participating, and we'll kind of wrap things up a little bit. So what else is changing? We had to make some little changes in IACRA. Honestly, you won't even notice the changes unless you're an examiner, you know, or maybe an ASI. You might see some of the tables had to change, but really it's not going to impact you folks as instructors or applicants. There have been a lot of changes to the knowledge test questions. I really haven't mentioned this. I said up front that we recognize that our knowledge test questions have become outdated, etc., irrelevant. And I told you that the ACS was designed to be a new standard for what was, or I mean, what is an appropriate knowledge test question. So I'm happy to tell you that every single private pilot airplane and every single instrument airplane question has been completely what we call reboarded, reevaluated against the Airman certification standard. There were a lot of questions that we absolutely just threw out because the questions just weren't relevant. They might have been interesting facts, but not really relevant, operationally speaking. A lot of things that were outdated were removed, such as ADF questions were all removed from the database. And actually, these questions have been used in testing for several months now. If you took a private pilot airplane or instrument airplane knowledge test, I think we started rolling them out around April or May, somewhere in that ballpark. Then you actually took what we call an ACS test because the knowledge questions had been boarded and reevaluated. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're all absolutely perfect. We still find things and we still continue to improve our testing questions, but we made a significant improvement in the content of our material based on the ACS. So that's been a big change going on in the background. I do want to mention to you our knowledge test report. This is a good change that we can't wait to deploy. Currently, your knowledge test reports list PLT codes, or what we also call learning statement codes, that tell you what type of material that you missed on the knowledge test. Right, here's an example, PLT 414, and then you have to go look at the guide to figure out what that actually meant. And then your examiner has to relate that back to the ACS to know what element to include in your check ride. We cannot wait, but soon we'll be able to actually publish ACS codes on your knowledge test report. And now you can see how that ACS code can be so helpful, because instead of having a very broad, generic description of the material that you missed, we can give you a much more specific idea of what content was unsatisfactory. If you're curious when that's going to happen, our computer testing system that we have today is not able to print those ACS codes. So we are currently working to make changes to that system to print the ACS code directly on the knowledge test report. So That's coming in the future, and we cannot wait to get that implemented. That's going to really help things in testing. So when's this all going to go into effect? Well, private airplane and instrument airplane only, those ACS documents actually went into effect on June 15th of 2016. You probably already know that, okay, because those are now used for check rides as of June 15th. We do still have the instrument PTS available for those taking check rides in rotorcraft and powerlift categories, because those have not yet been translated over into the ACS style. We do also have an unmanned aircraft system ACS, so we have 3 ACS documents in total: the unmanned aircraft systems, and then the private pilot airplane and instrument rating airplane documents. We are currently working on commercial, ATP, flight instructor, etc. Those are going to follow out in the next couple of years, and we do recognize it will take several years for all of the practical test standards to be replaced with the Airman certification standards. We know there's going to be a transition period for a while where you're going to have, you know, say for example, rotorcraft might be issued via the practical test standards, and then airplane is via the ACS. We can't rush these deployments too fast. It's a very complicated job working with industry to develop these documents, and we have to make sure that they're as accurate as possible. You guys deserve that from us, so we're taking our time and producing the best document that we can with our industry partners. So a little wrap-up tips. Take some time to get to know the ACS. You know, either print one at home, or you can look at it online. There are several vendors that are also selling nice printed versions of the ACS as well. And we do have some frequently asked questions located at our website. I'll give you the link for that in just a moment. Odds are, because we've been doing this for several months now, the questions that you have right now have already been addressed in the frequently asked questions. So we encourage you to look at the FAQ, see if you can find your question there, and if you can't, then you're certainly welcome to follow up your question with us. I'll give you an email in just a minute. Of course, remember, as an applicant, you have to be prepared for all the elements, because you don't know exactly which ones the examiner is going to select, right, in preparation. So here's your slide that gives you additional resources. Probably the most popular one is our website, AFS 630, and there's the address there. Again, I'm going to email you this presentation, so you don't have to write it down. This includes our frequently asked questions, and there's also a spot for you to subscribe to updates. I would really encourage you to subscribe. That way, as additional changes or additional ACS documents are released, you'll receive an email. So you'll know automatically, you know, that something new has been released. We do have an ACS focus team, which basically you can think of as a help desk. And I've given you the address there, the email address. These are subject matter experts that have played a really critical role in developing the Airman certification standards. They're about as close to an expert as you can get, and they will personally respond to every question. So if you have a question and you don't see it in the frequently asked questions, you're welcome to submit your question here by email, and the team will respond to you. If your question by chance has already been asked in the frequently asked questions, they will normally just refer you back to the FAQs, because that's kind of easier to give one response, you know, for everyone there. We do also have online training course. I mentioned this earlier. FAASTeam.gov course ALC 449 is available to you. And then finally, we do have a previously recorded webinar. It's very similar to this webinar, but not this exact one. And there's the YouTube link. I know that looks like it's misspelled. It's not, I promise. It's just the way YouTube does shortened addresses. So if you felt this presentation went too fast and you want to see it again a little bit slower, you can certainly watch that video whenever you like. And I didn't mention this earlier, but we're going to make an effort to update the recorded webinar with today's webinar, because there have been some changes and some updates. So if your question was not answered, we will respond to you by email. Remember, everyone's going to receive an email response. It normally takes us about a week or so to get those compiled and vetted and everything, because we want to give you good answers. That basically wraps up today's presentation. I see it is 2 o'clock Central, so we are right on schedule at 1 hour. We will leave the webinar open for a few minutes for those of you that might be typing questions and you have not yet hit send, because I don't want to kick you out without finishing your thought. Otherwise, this concludes our webinar. Thank you so much for attending, and we'll talk to you next time.